The kidney she donated anonymously was now keeping her long-lost brother alive. Sarah Thompson's act of compassion had unknowingly reunited her with the family she never knew existed. Sarah's fingers trembled as she stared at the computer screen, the fluorescent lights of the hospital's records room casting a harsh glow on her pale face. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second punctuating the gravity of her discovery. She had come here looking for closure, a way to feel connected to the anonymous recipient of her kidney. Instead, she found a name that sent shockwaves through her carefully constructed world: Mark Sullivan. The similarities were too striking to ignore. Same blood type, same age, born in the same hospital on the same day. Sarah's heart raced as she scrolled through the file, her mind reeling with possibilities. Could it be mere coincidence, or was there a deeper connection waiting to be unearthed? She leaned back in her chair, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her chest. The sterile smell of disinfectant that usually comforted her now felt suffocating. Sarah closed her eyes, memories of her childhood in foster care flooding back, the constant longing for a family, the unanswered questions about her origins. A soft knock on the door jolted her back to reality. Dr. Emily Chen, her mentor and the lead surgeon on Mark's transplant, peered in with concern etched on her face. "Sarah, are you all right? You've been in here for hours." Sarah quickly minimized the screen, guilt washing over her. She knew she shouldn't have accessed these records, but the pull had been too strong to resist. "I'm fine, drive, Chen. Just double-checking some post-op notes." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the half-truth. "You know, you've been different since the transplant. Is there something you want to talk about?" Sarah hesitated, the weight of her secret pressing against her lips. But fear held her back, fear of the consequences, of shattering the delicate balance she had achieved in her life. "It's nothing," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." Emily nodded, unconvinced but unwilling to push further. "Well, don't stay too late. And Sarah, remember, donor anonymity is there for a reason. It protects everyone involved." As the door closed behind Emily, Sarah felt a mix of relief and frustration. She turned back to the computer, her finger hovering over the mouse. With a deep breath, she closed Mark's file and logged out of the system. But the information she had seen couldn't be unseen, and questions buzzed in her mind like angry bees. Outside, the Chicago skyline glittered against the night sky, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Sarah's heart. As she made her way through the hospital corridors, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hallways, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change irrevocably. She paused outside the transplant recovery ward, her hand resting on the door. Beyond it lay Mark Sullivan, no longer just a faceless recipient, but a potential key to her past. Sarah's chest tightened as she imagined him lying there, her kidney now a part of him, connecting them in ways she never could have anticipated. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped her out of her reverie. Sarah quickly composed herself as a night nurse rounded the corner, offering a polite nod as she passed. Once alone again, Sarah took a steadying breath and pushed through the door. The recovery ward was dimly lit, the soft beeping of monitors creating a soothing rhythm. Sarah moved quietly past the sleeping patients, her eyes scanning the names on the beds until she found him. Mark Sullivan. She approached cautiously, taking in every detail. His sandy hair, the curve of his jaw, the shape of his nose. She searched for any resemblance to herself. In sleep, his face was relaxed, free from the pain and worry that often plagued transplant patients. Sarah's hand hovered over his, the urge to make contact almost overwhelming. But she held back, knowing that a single touch could shatter the fragile barrier between her past and present. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the humming machinery. "And who am I?" As if in response, Mark stirred slightly, his brow furrowing in his sleep. Sarah stepped back, suddenly afraid of being discovered. She retreated from the room, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. Back in the safety of her apartment, Sarah paced restlessly, unable to shake the feeling that she stood on the precipice of a life-altering discovery. She pulled out her phone, fingers hovering over the keypad. After a moment's hesitation, she dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "Detective Morrison? It's Sarah Thompson. I need your help." The seeds of a journey that would challenge everything Sarah thought she knew about family, identity, and the bonds that tie us together had been planted. As she stared out at the city lights, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, a missing piece of herself was waiting to be found. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, her mind still whirling from the previous night's discovery. The bustling corridors and the familiar scent of antiseptic did little to calm her nerves. As she changed into her scrubs, her fingers brushed against the small scar on her abdomen, a permanent reminder of her donation and the unexpected connection it had forged. Her first stop was Mark's room. She hesitated at the doorway, steeling herself before entering. To her surprise, Mark was awake, sitting up in bed and leafing through a magazine. "Good morning," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "How are you feeling today, Mr. Sullivan?" Mark looked up, his blue eyes, startlingly similar to her own, meeting hers. "Better, thanks. Still sore, but they tell me that's normal." Sarah nodded, checking his vitals with practiced efficiency. As she worked, she couldn't help but study his features more closely. The shape of his ears, the arch of his eyebrows, each similarity she noticed sent a jolt through her. "You know," Mark said, breaking the silence, "you remind me of someone. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something familiar about you." Sarah's heart raced, but she managed a polite smile. "Oh, I have one of those faces, I guess." Mark chuckled, then winced slightly at the movement. "No, it's not that. Never mind. I'm probably just loopy from the meds." As Sarah finished her checks, she found herself lingering, reluctant to leave. "Mr. Sullivan, if you don't mind me asking, do you have any family coming to visit?" A shadow passed over Mark's face. "No, not really. I was adopted as a baby. Never knew my birth parents, and my adoptive parents passed a few years ago. It's just me." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She gripped the railing of the bed to steady herself, her mind reeling with the implications. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, concern evident in his voice. Sarah nodded quickly. "Yes, sorry. Just a bit lightheaded. I should go get some coffee." She hurried from the room, her heart pounding. In her haste, she nearly collided with Dr. Chen. "Whoa, Sarah. What's the rush?" Emily steadied her, then frowned as she took in Sarah's pale face. "Are you all right?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing she couldn't keep her suspicions to herself any longer. "Dr. Chen, can we talk? Privately?" Minutes later, they were sequestered in Emily's office. Sarah paced nervously as she recounted her discovery and her growing suspicions about her connection to Mark. Emily listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. When Sarah finished, Emily leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed in thought. "Sarah, I understand why you're shaken by this, but you have to be careful. Even if your suspicions are correct, and that's a big if, there are strict protocols in place for a reason. Donor anonymity protects both parties. But what if he's my brother?" Sarah countered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Don't we have a right to know?" Emily sighed, her eyes softening with sympathy. "It's not that simple. There are ethical considerations, not to mention legal ones. We can't just run genetic tests on a hunch." Sarah slumped into a chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "So what am I supposed to do? Just ignore it?" "For now, yes," Emily said gently. "Focus on your job, on Mark's recovery. If there truly is a connection, there may be a proper way to pursue it later. But right now, any rash actions could jeopardize your career and Mark's recovery." Sarah nodded reluctantly, knowing Emily was right but feeling no less conflicted. As she left the office, her phone buzzed with a text from Detective Morrison. "Got some info. Meet me at the usual spot after your shift." The rest of Sarah's day passed in a blur. She went through the motions of her duties, her mind constantly drifting back to Mark and the possibilities his existence represented. By the time her shift ended, she was mentally exhausted but buzzing with anticipation for her meeting with Morrison. The usual spot was a small diner a few blocks from the hospital, a place where the detective had often met Sarah during the early days of her search for information about her birth parents. As she slid into the booth across from Morrison, the familiar smell of coffee and grilled onions brought back a flood of memories. Detective Jack Morrison hadn't changed much in the years since they'd last met, still gruff, with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and eyes that had seen too much. He pushed a manila folder across the table without preamble. "Your hunch was right," he said, his voice low. "There's definitely something fishy about your adoption." And Mark Sullivan's too. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of old documents, birth certificates, adoption records, and what looked like internal memos from the adoption agency. Both you and Sullivan were processed through the same agency, Morrison explained. Normally, that wouldn't mean much. But I did some digging, and it turns out that agency was shut down about 20 years ago amid allegations of some pretty shady practices. Sarah's eyes widened as she scanned the documents. What kind of practices? Morrison leaned in closer. Illegal adoptions, falsified records, even rumors of baby trafficking. Nothing was ever proven in court, but the agency folded under the pressure of the investigation. Sarah felt sick to her stomach. The implications were staggering. Are you saying Mark and I might have been part of this? Morrison shrugged. It's possible. The dates line up. But Sarah, you need to understand, if you pull on this thread, there's no telling what might unravel. Are you sure you want to go down this road? Sarah stared at the documents, her mind racing. On one hand, the prospect of uncovering the truth about her origins was tantalizing. On the other, she knew that doing so could open up a Pandora's box of complications, for herself, for Mark, and for countless others who might have been affected by the agency's practices. I don't know, she admitted finally. But I do know I can't just ignore this. What would you do, Jack? The detective was quiet for a long moment, absently stirring his coffee. Honestly, I'd probably dig deeper, but I'm a stubborn old cop with nothing to lose. You've got a career, a life you've built. This could upend all of that. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of his words. As she left the diner, the folder tucked securely in her bag, she felt as though she stood at a crossroads. Each path forward was fraught with potential consequences, yet the pull of the unknown was undeniable. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. The face of the man in the hospital bed, Mark, her potential brother, kept appearing in her thoughts. She thought about the loneliness she'd felt growing up, the constant wondering about where she came from. And she thought about Mark, recovering from surgery, unaware that the very person who had saved his life might also be the family he never knew he had. With a sigh, Sarah reached for her phone and pulled up her email. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before she began to type. Dear Dr. Chen, I've given our conversation a lot of thought. I understand the ethical concerns, but I can't ignore the possibility of this connection. I'm formally requesting a genetic test to determine if there's a familial relationship between myself and Mark Sullivan. I understand if this isn't possible, but I had to ask. Thank you for your understanding, Sarah Thompson. As she hit send, Sarah felt a mix of anxiety and relief wash over her. Whatever came next, she knew there was no turning back. The search for answers had begun, and with it, a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about family, identity, and the invisible threads that connect us all. The next morning, Sarah's thumb hovered over the send button on her phone, a message to Detective Morrison drafted and ready to go. She had tossed and turned all night, her dreams filled with fragmented images of hospital corridors and faces she couldn't quite recognize. With a deep breath, she pressed send, setting in motion a chain of events that would irrevocably change her life. Jack, I need to know more. Can we meet again? As she made her way to the hospital, the city seemed different somehow. Every face she passed on the street held the possibility of a hidden connection. Every family she saw made her wonder about the true nature of their bonds. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, making each step feel leaden. The hospital corridors, once a second home to her, now felt charged with potential secrets. As she approached Mark's room for her morning rounds, her heart raced. She paused at the doorway, taking a moment to compose herself before entering. Mark was sitting up in bed, his color noticeably better than the day before. He smiled as she entered, and Sarah felt a jolt of recognition at the familiar curve of his lips. Good morning, Mr. Sullivan, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. How are you feeling today? Much better, thanks, Mark replied. And please, call me Mark. Mr. Sullivan makes me feel old. Sarah nodded, busying herself with checking his vitals to avoid meeting his eyes. As she worked, she could feel Mark studying her. You know, he said suddenly, I had the strangest dream last night. I was a kid again, playing in a park. There was another child there, a girl. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I knew she was important somehow. When I woke up, I had this overwhelming feeling of, I don't know, loss? Like I'd forgotten something crucial. Sarah's hands froze on the blood pressure cuff. She looked up, meeting Mark's gaze. In that moment, she felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, one word away from plunging into unknown depths. Mark, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. A sharp knock on the door interrupted her. Doctor. Chen entered, her expression unreadable. Sarah, can I speak with you for a moment? With a mix of relief and frustration, Sarah excused herself and followed Emily into the hallway. As soon as the door closed behind them, Emily turned to her, her voice low and urgent. I got your email. Sarah, I hope you understand the gravity of what you're asking. This isn't just about you and Mark anymore. If there's truth to your suspicions, it could implicate the entire adoption system. Sarah nodded, her resolve strengthening. I know, Emily, but I can't just ignore this. It's not just about finding my family anymore. If there were illegal practices, don't we have a responsibility to uncover the truth? Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. I've spoken with the hospital's ethics committee. They're willing to consider your request, but they need more information. They want to meet with you this afternoon. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Sarah went through her rounds mechanically, her mind preoccupied with the upcoming meeting. At lunch, she met Detective Morrison in the hospital cafeteria, the buzz of conversation around them providing cover for their hushed discussion. I've been doing some more digging, Morrison said, sliding a USB drive across the table. Found some interesting connections between the adoption agency and a few high-profile names in the city. Politicians, business leaders, people with a lot to lose if this gets out. Sarah pocketed the drive, her appetite vanishing. What are you saying, Jack? That this goes beyond just a few illegal adoptions? Morrison leaned in, his voice barely audible. I'm saying be careful, Sarah. You start pulling on this thread, there's no telling who might want to shut you up. As Sarah made her way to the ethics committee meeting, Morrison's warning echoed in her mind. She felt as though she were walking into a lion's den, armed only with her convictions and a growing sense of the truth's importance. The meeting room was intimidating, a long table surrounded by stern-faced committee members. As Sarah took her seat, she could feel the weight of their collective gaze. Dr. Simmons, the head of the committee, spoke first. Ms. Thompson, we've reviewed your request and Dr. Chen's notes. Before we proceed, we need to understand your motivations. Are you prepared for the potential consequences of this investigation? Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. I am. This isn't just about me anymore. If there were illegal practices in the adoption system, don't we have an obligation to uncover the truth? There could be other families out there, other people like Mark and me, who deserve to know their history. The committee members exchanged glances. Dr. Simmons leaned forward, his expression grave. And what if the truth is painful? What if it disrupts not just your life, but Mr. Sullivan's as well? Are you prepared to live with that responsibility? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought of Mark, recovering in his hospital bed, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. For a moment, doubt crept in. Did she have the right to upend his life? But then she remembered the look in his eyes when he spoke of his dream, the undercurrent of longing in his voice. She thought of her own childhood, the constant ache of not knowing where she came from. I am, she said firmly. I believe that the truth, no matter how difficult, is better than a lifetime of uncertainty and lies. The committee deliberated for what felt like hours. Finally, Drive. Simmons addressed her again. Ms. Thompson, we've decided to approve your request for genetic testing. However, we have conditions. The test will be conducted discreetly, and the results will be reviewed by this committee before any action is taken. Do you agree to these terms? Sarah nodded, relief and anxiety warring within her. As she left the meeting, her phone buzzed with a text from Morrison. Meet me ASAP. New development. She found the detective waiting in his car outside the hospital, his expression grim. As she slid into the passenger seat, he handed her a file. Remember those high-profile names I mentioned? One of them just got spooked. There's been a flurry of activity, documents being shredded, emails deleted. Something big is about to go down. Sarah flipped through the file, her eyes widening as she recognized some of the names. These people. They were involved in the adoptions? Morrison nodded. Looks like it. And they're willing to go to great lengths to keep it quiet. As the implications sank in, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had started this journey looking for answers about her past, but now she found herself at the center of something much larger and more dangerous than she could have imagined. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison started the car, his expression determined. "Now, we dig deeper. But Sarah, I need to know, are you sure you want to see this through? Once we take the next step, there's no going back." Sarah looked out at the hospital, thinking of Mark and all the others who might be affected by what they uncovered. She thought of the life she had built, the career she loved, and the potential risks to it all. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was a sense of purpose, a conviction that she was on the right path. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever the truth is, I need to know. We need to know." As they pulled away from the hospital, Sarah felt as though she were leaving behind the last vestiges of her old life. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the promise of long-buried truths finally coming to light. The search for her identity had become something much larger, a quest for justice, for truth, and for the countless others who might be caught in the web of lies and secrets they were about to unravel. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of clandestine meetings and late-night research sessions. Sarah found herself living a double life. By day, she was the dedicated nurse, tending to Mark and her other patients with practiced care. By night, she delved deeper into the murky world of illegal adoptions and corporate cover-ups with Detective Morrison. As she entered Mark's room for her morning rounds, she felt the weight of her secret pressing down on her. Mark was sitting up, looking stronger each day, a newspaper spread across his lap. "Morning, Sarah," he said, his smile warm and familiar. "Have you seen this?" He pointed to an article, his brow furrowed. "There's been a shake-up at some big adoption agency. Doesn't say much, but it sounds like there might be a scandal brewing." Sarah's heart raced as she glanced at the article. It was vague, but she recognized the careful wording as an attempt to report on the very investigation she was part of without raising too many alarms. "That's concerning," she managed, trying to keep her voice neutral. "I hope it doesn't affect too many families." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, it's got me thinking about my own adoption. I never really looked into it much before, but now I'm wondering if I should." Sarah froze, her hand hovering over Mark's chart. This was the opening she had both longed for and dreaded. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Mark, there's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. But before she could continue, the door burst open. Dr. Chen entered, her face pale and her expression urgent. "Sarah, I need to speak with you immediately," she said, her tone brooking no argument. With an apologetic glance at Mark, Sarah followed Emily out into the hallway. As soon as the door closed behind them, Emily turned to her, her eyes wide with concern. "The genetic test results are back," she said, her voice low and tense. "Sarah, it's a match. You and Mark are siblings, twins, to be exact." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah leaned against the wall, her legs suddenly unsteady. Despite all her suspicions, hearing the confirmation was overwhelming. "There's more," Emily continued, glancing nervously down the hallway. "The ethics committee is in an uproar. Somehow, word of our investigation has leaked. There are people, powerful people, who are trying to shut this down." Sarah's mind raced, thinking of Morrison's warnings. What does this mean? For Mark? For the investigation? Emily shook her head, her expression grim. "I don't know. But Sarah, you need to be careful. This goes deeper than we imagined." As if on cue, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Morrison. "Meet me now." Urgent. Sarah hesitated, torn between her duty to her patients and the pull of the unfolding mystery. Emily seemed to sense her dilemma. "Go," she said softly. "I'll cover for you. But Sarah, whatever you do, be careful." Sarah nodded gratefully and hurried out of the hospital, her heart pounding. She found Morrison waiting in his car, his face etched with worry. "We've got a problem," he said as soon as she slid into the passenger seat. "My sources tell me there's a cleanup operation underway. They're destroying evidence, Sarah. If we don't move fast, we might lose everything." Sarah's mind whirled, thinking of the genetic test results, of Mark lying in his hospital bed, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Morrison started the car, pulling out into traffic with a grim determination. "We've got one shot at this. There's a storage facility on the outskirts of town. My source says that's where they're keeping the original adoption records, the ones that could blow this whole thing wide open." As they sped through the city, Sarah's phone buzzed incessantly. Messages from Emily, from the ethics committee, even one from Mark asking if she was okay. She ignored them all, her focus narrowing to the task at hand. The storage facility was a nondescript building, the kind that blended into the industrial landscape. As Morrison parked across the street, Sarah could see movement inside, shadows passing by windows, the occasional flash of a flashlight. "Looks like we're not the only ones here," Morrison muttered, reaching into his glove compartment and pulling out a small handgun. At Sarah's startled look, he shrugged. Better safe than sorry. They approached the building cautiously, Morrison leading the way. As they neared the entrance, a crash from inside made them both freeze. Voices, angry and urgent, echoed from within. "We need to move, now," Morrison hissed, pushing the door open. What followed was a blur of action. They raced through corridors lined with storage units, the sound of pursuit close behind. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears as they rounded a corner and came face to face with two men in suits, their expressions a mix of surprise and anger. "Stop right there," one of them shouted, reaching into his jacket. Morrison reacted instantly, tackling the man to the ground. "Sarah, run. Find the records." Sarah hesitated for a split second before sprinting down the corridor. She could hear the sounds of struggle behind her, but she forced herself to keep moving. Her eyes scanned the numbers on the storage units, searching for the one Morrison had mentioned. Finally, she found it. With shaking hands, she tried the handle, locked. In desperation, she looked around and spotted a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. Without thinking, she grabbed it and smashed it against the lock. Once, twice, 3 times, and the lock gave way. Inside, she found stacks of boxes and file cabinets. She tore through them, her eyes scanning documents at lightning speed. Birth certificates, adoption papers, internal memos, it was all here. The evidence of decades of illegal practices, of lives disrupted and families torn apart. And then she saw it, a file with her name. And right next to it, one with Mark's. With trembling hands, she opened them, her eyes drinking in the truth she had sought for so long. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped her back to reality. She quickly shoved the files into her bag, along with as many others as she could grab. As she turned to leave, she found herself face to face with one of the men in suits, his expression cold and determined. "Hand over the files," he said, his voice dangerously low. Sarah backed away, her mind racing. She could hear Morrison calling her name in the distance, the sound of sirens growing closer. In that moment, she made a decision. "You want the files?" she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Come and get them." With that, she turned and ran, clutching her bag of precious documents. She could hear the man pursuing her, but adrenaline fueled her steps. She burst out of the storage facility into the fading daylight, Morrison's voice guiding her to his car. As they sped away, the sound of sirens fading behind them, Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe. She looked down at her bag, knowing that within those pages lay the answers she had sought for so long, and the power to expose a truth that could change countless lives. "What now?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Morrison glanced at her, a mix of pride and concern in his eyes. Now we make sure the truth comes out, no matter what." As they drove back towards the city, Sarah's mind turned to Mark, to Emily, to all the lives that were about to be irrevocably changed. She had started this journey looking for her own identity, but she now realized it had become something much larger, a fight for justice, for truth, and for the right of every person to know their own story. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and difficult choices. But as Sarah clutched the bag of files to her chest, she knew there was no turning back. The truth, with all its complexities and consequences, was finally within reach. And she was determined to see it brought to light, no matter the cost. As the city lights came into view, Sarah's phone buzzed insistently. It was Emily, her voice tight with worry when Sarah finally answered. "Where are you? The ethics committee is in an uproar, and there are people here asking questions." "Serious people, Sarah." Sarah glanced at Morrison, who nodded grimly. "We're on our way back, Emily. We found something." Something big. Can you meet us? There was a pause on the other end of the line. My office, 1 hour. And Sarah? Be careful. The hospital parking garage was eerily quiet as Sarah and Morrison made their way to Emily's office, the bag of files clutched tightly to Sarah's chest. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat, every echoing footstep a possible pursuer. Emily was waiting for them, her usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, a testament to the stress of the past few hours. As Sarah spread the files across her desk, Emily's eyes widened. My God, she whispered, scanning the documents. This is bigger than we thought. Morrison nodded grimly. It goes back decades. Politicians, judges, business leaders, all involved in a network of illegal adoptions and cover-ups. Sarah pulled out her file and Mark's, laying them side by side. And we're part of it. Mark and I, we were separated intentionally. Our adoption was arranged by. She paused, her finger hovering over a familiar name. Emily gasped. Senator Hawkins? But he's on the hospital board. I know, Sarah finished, her voice hollow. The implications hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just about Sarah and Mark anymore. It was about a systemic abuse of power that had affected countless lives. What do we do now? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison leaned forward, his expression intense. We need to go public. These files, the DNA evidence, it's enough to blow this whole thing wide open. Sarah nodded, a mix of determination and fear coursing through her. But first, I need to tell Mark. He deserves to hear it from me. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. All three froze, exchanging panicked glances. Emily moved to answer it, her hand trembling slightly. It was Mark, pale and unsteady on his feet, but his eyes blazing with a mixture of confusion and determination. I heard nurses talking, he said, his voice hoarse. About you, Sarah, about us. Is it true? The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them. Sarah stood slowly, her heart pounding. Yes, she said simply, her voice catching. It's true, Mark. We're twins. Separated at birth. Mark stumbled slightly, Emily quickly moving to support him. His eyes never left Sarah's face, searching for something. Confirmation, perhaps, or a shared history he couldn't quite remember. I knew, he whispered. Somehow, I think I always knew. There was always something missing. Sarah moved towards him, hesitant at first, then with growing certainty. As she reached out, Mark met her halfway, their hands clasping in a grip that spoke of years of separation and a bond that could never truly be broken. The moment was shattered by the shrill ring of Morrison's phone. His face darkened as he listened to the caller. We've got company, he said grimly as he hung up. My source says they're on their way. We need to move, now. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Files were hastily shoved into bags, computers wiped, and plans hastily made. As they prepared to leave, Mark turned to Sarah, his expression a mix of fear and resolve. Whatever this is, whatever we're about to face, we face it together, right? Sarah nodded, feeling a surge of protectiveness for this brother she had only just found. Together, she affirmed. They made their way through the hospital corridors, Morrison leading the way, Emily bringing up the rear. The late-night quiet of the hospital felt oppressive, every shadow potentially hiding those who would silence them. As they neared the exit, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed behind them. Morrison cursed under his breath, urging them to move faster. They burst out into the night air, racing towards Morrison's car. But as they approached, two black SUVs screeched into the parking lot, cutting off their escape. This way, Emily shouted, leading them towards a side entrance of the hospital. They ran, the sound of pursuit close behind. Sarah's lungs burned, her body still weak from the donation surgery, but fear and adrenaline propelled her forward. She clutched Mark's hand tightly, unwilling to let go now that she had finally found him. They rounded a corner and found themselves in the hospital's old wing, a maze of corridors under renovation. Morrison quickly barricaded the door behind them with a fallen scaffolding, buying them precious minutes. What now? Mark gasped, leaning against the wall. Morrison's eyes scanned the area, his mind working quickly. We need to get this information out. If they catch us, it all goes away. Sarah's mind raced, then suddenly clicked. The media room, she said. 2 floors up. We can broadcast from there, send the files to every news outlet in the city. Emily nodded. I can access it with my keycard. But we'll need to hurry. As they made their way through the darkened corridors, the sound of their pursuers growing ever closer, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. All her life, she had searched for her identity, for a sense of belonging. Now, with her newfound brother by her side and the truth finally within reach, she knew that whatever happened next, she was exactly where she was meant to be. They reached the media room, Emily's trembling hands fumbling with the keycard. As the door swung open, the sound of breaking glass echoed from below. Their pursuers had broken through. Inside, banks of computers and broadcasting equipment filled the room. Morrison immediately set to work, his fingers flying over the keyboards. I need time, he growled. Keep them off us as long as you can. Sarah and Mark exchanged a look, a lifetime of unspoken understanding passing between them in an instant. They moved to the door, ready to face whatever came. Emily joined Morrison at the computers, her medical expertise helping to organize the files for maximum impact. We're sending these to every major news outlet, every law enforcement agency, she said, her voice tight with concentration. Once this goes out, there's no stopping it. The sound of footsteps grew louder, angry voices echoing through the corridors. Sarah gripped Mark's hand tightly, both of them tense and ready. Whatever happens, she said softly, I'm glad I found you. Mark nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Me too, sis, me too. The door burst open, men in suits flooding into the room. But at that moment, Morrison let out a triumphant shout. It's done. It's all out there. As chaos erupted around them, Sarah felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. The truth was out. Whatever happened next, the lies and secrets that had shaped her life, and the lives of countless others, were finally exposed to the light of day. In the midst of the commotion, as shouts filled the air and the future hung uncertain, Sarah and Mark stood side by side, newly reunited siblings facing the storm together. They had started this journey as strangers, a donor and a recipient linked by chance. Now, they stood as family, bound by blood, truth, and a shared determination to see justice done. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal battles, public scrutiny, and the challenge of rebuilding lives based on long-buried truths. But as Sarah looked at her brother, at Emily and Morrison who had risked everything to help them, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The truth, so long hidden, was finally free. And with it, the chance for healing, for justice, and for a future built on honesty and the unbreakable bonds of family. Both those we are born with and those we choose. As the chaos in the media room subsided, replaced by the methodical process of law enforcement taking statements and securing evidence, Sarah found herself in a quiet corner, the adrenaline of the past few hours finally wearing off. Mark sat beside her, both of them wrapped in shock blankets, the reality of their situation slowly sinking in. What happens now? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah shook her head, feeling equally lost. I don't know, but whatever it is, we face it together. A tall, stern-looking woman in a crisp suit approached them, her badge identifying her as Agent Ramirez from the FBI. Ms. Thompson, Mr. Sullivan, she said, her tone professional but not unkind. I understand you've been through a lot, but we need to ask you some questions. The next few hours were a blur of interviews, medical checks, and hushed conversations with lawyers who seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Emily and Morrison were sequestered in separate rooms, the gravity of their involvement becoming clearer with each passing minute. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through the hospital windows, Sarah and Mark found themselves in a quiet conference room, cups of untouched coffee growing cold before them. Agent Ramirez entered, her expression unreadable. The files you uncovered, she began, they're significant. We're talking about a conspiracy that spans decades, involving some of the most powerful people in the city, maybe even the country. Sarah nodded, feeling a mix of vindication and dread. What does this mean for us? For all the other families affected? Ramirez sighed, allowing a hint of compassion to show through her professional demeanor. It's complicated. There will be investigations, trials probably. Your lives are going to be under a microscope for a while. But, she paused, her expression softening slightly, what you've done here, it's going to help a lot of people find the truth about their origins. As Ramirez left, promising to return with more information, Sarah and Mark sat in silence, the weight of their actions settling over them. I keep thinking about our birth parents, Mark said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. Do you think they're still out there? Do you think they know? Sarah reached out, taking her brother's hand. I don't know, but we'll find out, together. The door opened again, this time revealing Emily, looking exhausted but relieved. They're letting me go for now, she explained, sinking into a chair. But I'll probably lose my medical license over this. Emily, I'm so sorry, Sarah began, but Emily waved her off. Don't be. What we did, it was right. It was necessary. As the day wore on, the hospital buzzed with activity. News vans crowded the parking lot, reporters clamoring for a glimpse of the siblings at the center of the growing scandal. Sarah and Mark watched the coverage on a small TV in their room, still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what they had uncovered. In a shocking development, one reporter announced, her voice filled with barely contained excitement, documents released last night implicate several high-ranking officials in a decades-long adoption scandal. At the center of this story are Sarah Thompson and Mark Sullivan, siblings separated at birth who uncovered the truth about their own adoption and, in the process, exposed a web of corruption that has affected countless families. Mark muted the TV, turning to Sarah with a mix of awe and trepidation. They're calling us whistleblowers, heroes even. But I don't feel like a hero. I feel overwhelmed? Sarah finished for him. Yeah, me too. A soft knock at the door interrupted their moment of shared vulnerability. Morrison entered, looking haggard but determined. How are you two holding up? He asked, his gruff voice tinged with concern. Sarah managed a weak smile. As well as can be expected, I guess. What about you? Are you in trouble? Morrison shrugged, a wry smile playing at his lips. Nothing I can't handle. Listen, I've been talking to some people. Lawyers, advocates for adoptee rights. They want to help. This thing we've started, it's bigger than just us now. As Morrison outlined the potential legal battles ahead, the support they were likely to receive, and the challenges they would face, Sarah found her mind wandering. She thought about all the other families out there, people like her and Mark who had grown up not knowing the truth about their origins. She thought about the parents who had lost children to this corrupt system, the lives irreparably altered by the greed and manipulation of those in power. We need to do more, she said suddenly, interrupting Morrison's explanation of potential class action lawsuits. This isn't just about exposing the truth. It's about helping all those other families, isn't it? About making sure this never happens again? Mark nodded, a new fire lighting in his eyes. Sarah's right. We've been given a platform, a voice. We need to use it. Morrison studied them both, a mix of pride and concern on his weathered face. It won't be easy. You'll be up against powerful people, institutions that don't want to change. We know, Sarah said, her voice steady. But we have to try. As the day progressed, Sarah and Mark began to formulate a plan. With Emily's medical expertise, Morrison's investigative skills, and their own newfound determination, they started to envision a foundation. An organization dedicated to helping other adoptees uncover the truth about their origins, to advocating for transparency in adoption processes, and to supporting families torn apart by corrupt practices. They worked tirelessly, even as lawyers came and went, as medical staff checked on their well-being, as the world outside the hospital walls clamored for their story. In those hours of shared purpose, Sarah felt a deep connection to Mark that went beyond their newly discovered biological link. They were partners now, united not just by blood but by a shared mission. As evening fell, bringing with it a momentary lull in the day's frenetic activity, Sarah found herself alone for the first time since the truth had come out. She stood by the window, looking out at the city lights flickering to life. The world out there seemed both familiar and utterly changed, as if the revelations of the past day had altered the very fabric of reality. She thought about her life before, the loneliness she had felt even in the midst of her busy career, the nagging questions about her origins that had driven her to become a living donor. She thought about Mark, recovering in a hospital bed, unaware that his savior was also his long-lost sister. The serendipity of it all was almost too much to comprehend. A soft knock pulled her from her reverie. It was Mark, looking tired but determined. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, joining her at the window. Sarah shook her head. "Too much to think about." "You?" "Same." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, I always felt like something was missing. Even when things were good, there was this emptiness. I thought maybe I was just ungrateful or depressed. But now you know, Sarah finished for him. Yeah, I felt it too. Like a phantom limb, something that should have been there but wasn't. They stood in companionable silence, watching the city below. After a while, Mark spoke again, his voice soft but firm. Whatever comes next, whatever battles we have to fight, I'm glad we're in this together. I'm glad I found you, sis. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, a warmth spreading through her chest. Me too, brother. Me too. As they stood there, two siblings reunited against all odds, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal battles, public scrutiny, and the monumental task of helping others affected by the adoption scandal. But for the first time in her life, she felt truly whole, truly connected. The truth had come at a high price, but it had also brought with it a precious gift, a brother, a purpose, and a chance to right the wrongs of the past. As the night deepened outside, Sarah and Mark began to talk in earnest about their plans for the future, their voices filled with hope and determination. They were no longer just victims of a corrupt system. They were survivors, whistleblowers, and now, advocates for change. Their journey had only just begun, but together, they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The following days unfolded in a whirlwind of activity. Sarah and Mark found themselves at the center of a media storm, their story capturing the nation's attention. News outlets clamored for interviews, legal experts debated the implications of their revelations on morning shows, and social media buzzed with discussions about adoption rights and government accountability. Amidst the chaos, Sarah and Mark clung to each other and their newfound purpose. They worked tirelessly with Emily and Morrison to establish the framework for their foundation, which they decided to call Reunite and Reconcile. Their mission was clear: to help other adoptees uncover the truth about their origins, advocate for transparency in adoption processes, and support families affected by unethical practices. One crisp morning, about a week after the initial revelations, Sarah and Mark sat in a sleek conference room, surrounded by a team of lawyers, PR specialists, and advocacy experts. The air was thick with anticipation as they prepared for their first major press conference. Remember, their media advisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Lydia, instructed, "Stick to the key points we discussed. Your personal story is powerful, but we need to keep the focus on the broader implications and our plans moving forward." Sarah nodded, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. She glanced at Mark, who gave her a reassuring smile. Despite the short time they had known each other, their bond had grown stronger with each passing day. They could now communicate volumes with just a look, a silent understanding born of shared experiences and a common goal. As they made their way to the hotel ballroom where the press conference was to be held, Sarah felt a hand on her arm. It was Emily, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and concern. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked softly. "Once you step into that room, there's no going back. Your lives will never be the same." Sarah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "We're sure," she said, speaking for both herself and Mark. "This is bigger than us now. We have to see it through." The ballroom was a sea of flashing cameras and eager reporters when they entered. Sarah felt a moment of panic, the sheer magnitude of what they were about to do hitting her all at once. But then she felt Mark's hand slip into hers, a silent gesture of support and unity. As they took their seats at the long table at the front of the room, Sarah scanned the crowd. Her eyes landed on a familiar face, Detective Morrison, standing at the back, his expression a mix of pride and watchfulness. He gave her a small nod, and Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for his unwavering support. Lydia stepped up to the microphone, her voice clear and professional as she introduced Sarah and Mark. And then, suddenly, it was time. Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding as she began to speak. "Good morning," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "My name is Sarah Thompson, and this is my brother, Mark Sullivan. A week ago, we were strangers. Today, we stand before you united, not just by the blood we share, but by a commitment to truth and justice." As Sarah recounted their story, the anonymous kidney donation, the shocking discovery of their relationship, and the subsequent uncovering of the adoption scandal, she could feel the room hanging on her every word. She spoke of the pain of separation, the years of uncertainty, and the profound impact of finally knowing the truth. Mark took over, his voice strong despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "But our story is just one of many," he said. "Across this country, there are countless individuals and families who have been affected by unethical adoption practices. People who have grown up not knowing their true origins, parents who were coerced into giving up their children, families torn apart by a system that prioritized profit over human dignity. Together, Sarah and Mark outlined their plans for the Reunite and Reconcile Foundation. They spoke of creating a database to help match separated families, of providing legal support to those seeking to uncover the truth about their adoptions, and of advocating for legislative changes to ensure transparency and ethical practices in all future adoptions. As they opened the floor for questions, the room erupted in a cacophony of voices. Reporters clamored for details, their queries ranging from deeply personal to broadly political. Sarah and Mark fielded the questions with a grace and poise that belied their lack of media experience, their shared determination carrying them through the toughest moments. One question, however, caught them both off guard. A reporter from a major national newspaper stood up, his expression grave. "Ms. Thompson, Mr. Sullivan," he began, "there are rumors circulating that your birth parents have come forward. Can you comment on this?" A hush fell over the room. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat, her eyes meeting Mark's in a moment of shared shock. They hadn't heard anything about this. Was it possible? After all this time, could their birth parents really have surfaced? Sarah leaned into the microphone, her voice slightly shaky. This is the first we're hearing of this," she admitted. "If it's true, we would certainly be open to meeting them. But our focus right now is on helping all the families affected by this scandal, not just our own." As the press conference wrapped up, Sarah and Mark were ushered back to the privacy of the conference room. The moment the doors closed behind them, they turned to Lydia, their expressions a mix of hope and apprehension. "Is it true?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Have our birth parents really come forward?" Lydia sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We don't know for sure," she admitted. "There have been several people claiming to be your birth parents since your story broke. We've been trying to verify their claims before bringing it to your attention." Sarah sank into a chair, feeling suddenly overwhelmed. The possibility of meeting their birth parents, of finally getting answers to the questions that had haunted them their entire lives, was both thrilling and terrifying. "What do we do?" she asked, looking from Lydia to Mark to Emily, who had joined them in the room. Emily stepped forward, her expression gentle but firm. "We proceed carefully," she said. "We can have DNA tests done to confirm any claims. But Sarah, Mark, you need to prepare yourselves. If this is true, it's going to open up a whole new chapter in this journey." As the team began to discuss the logistics of verifying potential birth parent claims, Sarah felt a familiar sense of determination settling over her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whether it was meeting their birth parents, fighting legal battles, or continuing to advocate for others, she knew they would face them together. She caught Mark's eye, seeing her own mix of emotions reflected there. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. No matter what happened next, no matter who else entered their lives, they would always have each other. The bond they had forged in the crucible of this experience was unbreakable. As the day wore on and plans were made, Sarah found herself returning to the window, looking out at the city below. The world out there was full of unknowns, potential birth parents, legal challenges, lives waiting to be changed by the truth they had uncovered. But for the first time in her life, Sarah felt ready to face those unknowns. She had found her brother, her purpose, and her voice. Whatever came next, she knew they would face it as they had faced everything else since discovering the truth, together, united by blood, truth, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The journey ahead would be long and undoubtedly filled with more twists and turns. But as Sarah turned back to the room, seeing Mark deep in discussion with their team, she felt a surge of hope. They had already overcome so much. Together, there was nothing they couldn't face. The truth had set them free, and now it was their turn to help others find their own freedom. It was a daunting task, but one they were ready to embrace with open hearts and unwavering determination. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah and Mark found themselves navigating a new reality. The Reunite and Reconcile Foundation was gaining traction, with donations pouring in and volunteers offering their services. They had assembled a team of dedicated professionals, lawyers, counselors, researchers, all committed to their cause. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah arrived at their newly established office, a converted warehouse space that buzzed with activity. As she made her way to her desk, she was stopped by their lead researcher, a brilliant young woman named Zoe. "Sarah, we've got something," Zoe said, her eyes bright with excitement. "Remember that database we've been building? We've found a pattern. A significant number of the adoptions we're investigating can be traced back to a single hospital in the Midwest." Sarah's heart raced as she followed Zoe to her computer. The screen displayed a complex web of connections, all leading back to St. Mary's Hospital in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. "This could be the break we've been looking for," Sarah breathed, her mind already racing with the implications. Just then, Mark burst into the office, his face flushed with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Sarah, we need to talk. Now." Sensing the urgency in his voice, Sarah followed him to a quiet corner of the office. Mark took a deep breath before speaking. "I just got off the phone with Lydia. They've verified one of the claims. Our birth mother. She's real, Sarah, and she wants to meet us." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah gripped the edge of a nearby desk, steadying herself. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Mark nodded, his eyes a storm of emotions. DNA confirmed it. Her name is Eleanor Winters. She's living in Seattle now. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of this new reality settling over them. Then, almost in unison, they reached for each other, embracing tightly. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice muffled against Mark's shoulder. Mark pulled back, his expression resolute. "We meet her. We get answers. But Sarah, whatever happens, we're in this together, right?" Sarah nodded, feeling a mix of fear and determination. "Together," she affirmed. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. As they made arrangements to fly to Seattle, Sarah and Mark threw themselves into their work with renewed vigor. The discovery about St. Mary's Hospital had opened up new avenues of investigation, and they were determined to follow every lead. The night before their flight, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. She stood by the window of her apartment, looking out at the city lights, her mind a tumult of questions. What would Eleanor be like? Why had she given them up? Did she know they had been separated? A soft knock at her door pulled her from her reverie. It was Mark, looking as sleepless as she felt. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, a wry smile on his face. Sarah shook her head, making room for him by the window. They stood in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. "I keep thinking about nature versus nurture," Mark said suddenly. "We grew up in completely different environments, and yet, there's so much about us that's similar. Our drive to help others, our stubbornness." Sarah chuckled. "Our terrible taste in movies?" Mark grinned, nudging her shoulder. "Speak for yourself. My taste in movies is impeccable." As their laughter faded, a more somber mood settled over them. "Do you think she'll like us?" Sarah asked softly, voicing the fear that had been nagging at her. Mark was quiet for a moment before responding. "I don't know. But Sarah, we've built our lives, our identities, without her. Meeting her doesn't change who we are or what we've accomplished." Sarah nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude for her brother's steady presence. "You're right. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together." The flight to Seattle was tense, both siblings lost in their own thoughts. As they landed and made their way to the small cafe where they had agreed to meet Eleanor, Sarah felt her heart racing. The cafe was cozy, with warm wooden tables and the rich aroma of coffee filling the air. And there, at a corner table, sat a woman who could only be their mother. Her hair was silver, her face lined with age, but her eyes, Sarah realized with a start, were the same shade of blue as her own. Eleanor stood as they approached, her hands trembling slightly. "Sarah, Mark?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, they came together in a tight embrace. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, years of longing and uncertainty pouring out in that single moment. As they sat down, wiping away tears and trying to compose themselves, Sarah studied Eleanor's face. She could see echoes of herself and Mark there, the shape of their eyes, the curve of their chin. I don't know where to begin," Eleanor said, her voice shaky. "There's so much I want to tell you, so much I need to explain." Mark reached out, taking one of Eleanor's hands in his own. "Start at the beginning," he said gently. "We're here to listen." And so, over steaming cups of coffee that grew cold as the hours passed, Eleanor shared her story. She had been young, barely out of high school, when she found herself pregnant with twins. Her boyfriend had left her parents had turned their backs on her, and she had felt utterly alone. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Eleanor said, her voice thick with regret. "I thought you would have a better life with adoptive parents who were ready for children. I never knew. I never imagined they would separate you." As Eleanor spoke of her years of searching, of the walls she had hit trying to find information about their adoptions, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. There was anger at the system that had torn them apart, sympathy for the young woman Eleanor had been, and a deep, aching sadness for all the years they had lost. "When I saw your story on the news," Eleanor continued, "I couldn't believe it. My children, reunited after all these years. And doing such important work. I'm so proud of you both." The words hit Sarah like a physical force. Pride. It was an emotion she had always longed to see in a parent's eyes. Even as she had built a life and career, she was proud of herself. As the afternoon wore on, they shared stories of their lives, filling in the gaps of the years they had missed. There were moments of laughter, of tears, of quiet reflection. And through it all, Sarah felt a growing sense of peace. The missing piece of her identity, the questions that had haunted her for so long, were finally being answered. As the cafe began to fill with the dinner crowd, they reluctantly prepared to leave. But before they did, Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn photo album. "I've carried this with me for years," she said, her voice soft. "Pictures of you as babies, before I gave you up. I want you to have it." Sarah and Mark leaned in close, their heads together as they flipped through the pages. There they were, tiny and perfect, cradled in Eleanor's arms. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as she traced a finger over the image of her infant self, marveling at the journey that had brought her to this moment. As they said their goodbyes, promising to keep in touch and meet again soon, Sarah felt a shift within herself. The anger and confusion that had driven her for so long were still there, but they were tempered now by understanding and a fragile hope for the future. Walking back to their hotel, Sarah and Mark were quiet, each processing the emotional weight of the day. Finally, Mark spoke. "You know, meeting her doesn't change our mission. If anything, it makes what we're doing even more important." Sarah nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "You're right. There are so many others out there, searching for answers, for connection. We need to help them." As they reached their hotel, the sun was setting over Seattle, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Sarah paused, taking in the beauty of the moment. "Whatever comes next," she said, turning to Mark, "I'm glad we're facing it together." Mark smiled, slinging an arm around her shoulders. "Always, sis, always." As they headed inside, Sarah felt a sense of completion she had never experienced before. She had found her brother, met her birth mother, and discovered a purpose that went beyond herself. The road ahead was still long, with many challenges to face, but for the first time in her life, Sarah felt truly whole. The truth had set them free, and now it was their turn to help others find their own freedom. It was a daunting task, but one they were ready to embrace with open hearts and unwavering determination. Together, they would continue to unravel the web of secrets and lies, bringing light to the shadows of the past and hope for a more transparent future. As Sarah and Mark returned to their work at the Reunite and Reconcile Foundation, they found themselves reinvigorated by their meeting with Eleanor. The experience had not only provided personal closure but had also deepened their understanding of the complex emotions involved in adoption and reunion. One morning, about a week after their return from Seattle, Sarah arrived at the office to find it buzzing with unusual excitement. Zoe, their lead researcher, waved her over urgently. "Sarah, you need to see this," Zoe said, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and anticipation. "Remember that pattern we found with St. Mary's Hospital? Well, we've uncovered something much bigger." Sarah leaned over Zoe's shoulder, her heart racing as she took in the information on the screen. The web of connections they had discovered earlier had expanded exponentially, revealing a network that spanned multiple states and involved several prominent figures in politics and healthcare. This is huge," Sarah breathed, her mind reeling with the implications. "Have you told Mark yet?" As if on cue, Mark burst into the office, waving a stack of papers. "Sarah, you won't believe what just came in. We've received dozens of new testimonies from adoptees and birth parents, all pointing to the same network we've been investigating." The siblings shared a look of determination. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for, the chance to blow the lid off the entire corrupt system. Over the next few days, Sarah, Mark, and their team worked tirelessly to compile and verify the new information. They brought in legal experts to help navigate the complex web of laws and regulations they were up against. As the full scope of the scandal became clear, they realized they were dealing with something far more insidious than they had initially imagined. "It's not just about illegal adoptions anymore," Mark said during a late-night strategy session. "We're looking at a systematic cover-up involving hospital administrators, judges, even politicians. They've been burying evidence for decades." Sarah nodded grimly, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "We need to be careful about how we proceed. These are powerful people we're up against. They're not going to go down without a fight." As if to underscore her point, strange things began happening around the foundation. They noticed unmarked cars parked outside their office, and some of their volunteers reported being followed. One night, they arrived to find their office had been broken into, though nothing seemed to be missing. Concerned for their safety and the integrity of their investigation, Sarah and Mark decided to reach out to Detective Morrison for help. The gruff detective listened to their findings with growing concern. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," he said, his voice grave. "But you're doing important work. I'll assign some trusted officers to keep an eye on things, but you two need to watch your backs." Despite the mounting pressure and threats, Sarah and Mark pressed on. They began preparing a comprehensive report detailing their findings, intending to release it to the media and relevant authorities simultaneously. It was a dangerous game they were playing, but the stakes were too high to back down now. As they worked, Sarah found herself thinking often of Eleanor and the story she had shared. How many other young women had been in similar situations, pressured to give up their children without fully understanding the consequences? How many families had been torn apart by a system that prioritized profit over human dignity? One evening, as they were putting the finishing touches on their report, Mark looked up from his computer, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking about nature versus nurture again," he said. "Meeting Eleanor, learning about her story, it's made me realize how much of who we are is shaped by our experiences, not just our genetics." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "And yet, there's something undeniable about the connection we share, something that goes beyond our shared DNA or our similar experiences with the Foundation." "Exactly," Mark agreed. "It's like we're two parts of a whole, different but complementary, and now we're using that connection to help others." As they spoke, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor. She had been keeping in regular contact with their birth mother, slowly building a relationship that, while sometimes awkward, was deeply meaningful. "Eleanor wants to help," Sarah said, showing the message to Mark. "She's offering to speak publicly about her experience, to put a face to the stories we're uncovering." Mark's eyes widened. That's incredibly brave of her. But are we sure we want to involve her in this? It could be dangerous." Sarah considered for a moment. "I think we need to let her make that choice. She's had her agency taken away from her once before. We shouldn't do the same." They called Eleanor, explaining the situation and the potential risks. Her response was immediate and resolute. "I've spent years feeling powerless," she said, her voice steady. "If sharing my story can help prevent others from going through what we did, then that's what I want to do." With Eleanor's testimony adding a powerful personal dimension to their report, Sarah and Mark felt ready to move forward. They set a date for the release, coordinating with trusted media contacts and legal advisors to ensure maximum impact. The night before the scheduled release, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. She paced her apartment, alternating between nervous anticipation and moments of doubt. Was this the right thing to do? Were they prepared for the backlash that would inevitably come? A soft knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. It was Mark, looking as sleepless as she felt. "Couldn't rest either?" he asked with a wry smile. Sarah shook her head, making room for him to enter. They settled on the couch, the familiar comfort of each other's presence helping to ease some of the tension. "Are we doing the right thing, Mark?" Sarah asked softly. "Once we release this report, there's no going back. We'll be taking on some of the most powerful people in the country." Mark was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "I think," he said slowly, "that we've already passed the point of no return. From the moment we discovered the truth about our own adoption, We took on the responsibility of fighting for others in similar situations. We can't back down now." Sarah nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "You're right. It's not just about us anymore. It's about all the families who have been torn apart, all the people who have been denied their true identities. They deserve the truth, no matter how difficult it is to uncover." As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Sarah and Mark prepared themselves for the day ahead. They knew that once their report was released, their lives would change irrevocably. They would be thrust into the spotlight, facing scrutiny, criticism, and potentially even danger. But as they looked at each other, they saw the same determination reflected in each other's eyes. They had come into this world together, been separated by forces beyond their control, and found each other again against all odds. Now, they stood united, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. "Whatever happens," Sarah said, reaching out to squeeze Mark's hand, "we face it together." Mark nodded, his grip firm and reassuring. "Together," he agreed, "always." As they left the apartment and headed towards the Foundation's office, the city was just beginning to wake up. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. In a few hours, their report would be released, and the world would know the truth they had worked so hard to uncover. It was a daunting prospect, but Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. They had done everything they could to prepare, to ensure the accuracy of their findings and the safety of those involved. Now, it was time to let the truth speak for itself. As they walked, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them to this point. From strangers connected by an anonymous organ donation to siblings united in a fight for justice, their path had been anything but straightforward. Yet every twist and turn had led them here, to this moment of truth. Whatever the day might bring, whether triumph or turmoil, Sarah knew that she and Mark would face it as they had faced everything else since discovering the truth about their past. Together, bound by blood, truth, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting a golden light over the city. Sarah and Mark exchanged one last look of solidarity before stepping into their office, ready to change the world. As Sarah and Mark entered their office, the atmosphere was charged with a mix of nervous energy and determination. Their team was already assembled, each person aware of the gravity of what they were about to do. Zoe was at her computer, ready to upload their report to multiple secure servers. Their legal team stood by, prepared to field the inevitable flood of inquiries and challenges. Sarah took a deep breath, looking around at the faces of those who had become more than colleagues. They were fellow crusaders in this fight for truth and justice. "Is everyone ready?" she asked, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. A chorus of affirmative responses filled the room. Mark stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. "It's time," he said softly. With a nod to Zoe, the process began. Their comprehensive report, detailing the vast network of illegal adoptions, the officials involved, and the systemic cover-ups, was released to selected media outlets, law enforcement agencies, and watchdog organizations simultaneously. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, their phones were ringing off the hook. News alerts began popping up on every screen, and social media exploded with reactions to their revelations. As the day progressed, Sarah and Mark found themselves at the center of a media storm. They gave interviews, answered questions, and reiterated their commitment to uncovering the truth and helping those affected by the scandal. By evening, the story had gone national. Major news networks were running special reports, legal experts were weighing in on the potential ramifications, and politicians were scrambling to distance themselves from those implicated in the report. Amidst the chaos, Sarah received a call from Eleanor. "I've been watching the news," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you both. And I'm ready to tell my story publicly if you think it will help." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "Are you sure, Eleanor? Once you step into the spotlight, there's no going back." "I'm sure," Eleanor replied, her voice growing stronger. "I've been silent for too long. It's time for me to stand with you and Mark." As night fell, Sarah and Mark finally had a moment alone. They stood by the window of their office, looking out at the city lights, the weight of the day's events settling over them. "We did it," Mark said softly, a note of awe in his voice. "We actually did it," Sarah nodded, feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. "This is just the beginning, though. There's still so much work to do." Over the next few weeks, the fallout from their report continued to ripple through society. Investigations were launched, arrests were made, and the adoption system came under intense scrutiny. Sarah and Mark found themselves testifying before congressional committees, their story and their evidence shining a light on decades of corruption and malpractice. Eleanor, true to her word, shared her story publicly. Her emotional testimony of being a young, vulnerable mother pressured into giving up her children added a powerful human element to the ongoing investigations. Her courage inspired other birth parents to come forward, each story adding to the growing call for reform. But as their influence grew, so did the pushback. Sarah and Mark began receiving threats. Attempts were made to discredit their foundation and their personal histories. One night, Sarah's apartment was broken into, a clear warning. Concerned for their safety, Detective Morrison insisted on providing them with police protection. "You've made some powerful enemies," he warned. "You need to be careful." Despite the challenges and dangers, Sarah and Mark pressed on. They worked tirelessly, expanding their foundation's reach, providing support to countless families affected by the adoption scandal, and advocating for legislative changes to prevent such abuses from happening in the future. 1 year after the release of their initial report, Sarah and Mark stood before a crowd gathered for the opening of the Reunite and Reconcile Foundation's new headquarters. The building would serve not only as their base of operations but also as a resource center for adoptees and birth parents seeking information and support. As Sarah looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, many new, all united in their quest for truth and justice, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She glanced at Mark, seeing her own emotions reflected in his eyes. "A year ago," Sarah began, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "my brother and I stood at a crossroads. We had uncovered a truth about our own past that shook us to our core. We could have chosen to keep that truth to ourselves, to focus solely on our own healing. But we knew that our story was just one of many." Mark stepped forward, continuing where Sarah left off. "We chose to fight not just for ourselves, but for every person who has been denied their true identity, for every family torn apart by a system that prioritized profit over human dignity. It hasn't been an easy fight, and it's far from over. But standing here today, seeing all of you, we know that we're not alone in this battle." As they concluded their speech and the crowd erupted in applause, Sarah felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see Eleanor, tears glistening in her eyes. "I never thought I'd see this day," Eleanor said, pulling both Sarah and Mark into a tight embrace. "My children, reunited and changing the world. I'm so proud of you both." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Sarah and Mark found a quiet moment alone. They stood on the balcony of their new office, looking out at the city skyline. "Do you ever wonder," Mark asked, "what our lives would have been like if we hadn't found each other? If you hadn't decided to donate your kidney?" Sarah considered for a moment. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but then I think about all the people we've helped, all the families we've reunited. As painful as our journey has been, I can't regret the path that led us here." Mark nodded, a soft smile playing on his lips. "You know, when I was recovering from the transplant, before I knew you were my sister, I used to think about my anonymous donor. I would try to imagine what kind of person would be selfless enough to give a part of themselves to a stranger." "And?" Sarah asked, curious. "Did I live up to your imagination?" Mark laughed, pulling her into a one-armed hug. "You exceeded it, sis. In every way." As they stood there, the cool night air washing over them, Sarah felt a sense of peace she had never known before. The road ahead was still long, with many battles yet to be fought. But she was no longer the lost, searching soul she had once been. She had found her brother, reconnected with her birth mother, and discovered a purpose greater than herself. She had faced her fears, stood up to powerful adversaries, and emerged stronger for it. And through it all, she had learned that family was not just about blood or shared history. It was about choice, about standing together in the face of adversity. As the city lights twinkled below them, a testament to the countless lives and stories intertwined in the urban landscape, Sarah turned to Mark. "Whatever comes next," she said, "we face it together, right?" Mark's response was immediate and unwavering. "Always, Sarah, always." And in that moment, looking out at the city that had been the backdrop to their extraordinary journey, Sarah knew that they had not just found each other, they had found themselves. In uncovering the truth about their past, they had forged a future built on hope, justice, and the unbreakable bond of siblinghood. The kidney that had once connected them as donor and recipient now seemed like a small part of the profound connection they shared. They were two halves of a whole, united by blood, strengthened by adversity, and driven by a shared purpose. As they turned to head back inside, ready to face whatever challenges the future might hold, Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought them together. From strangers to siblings, from victims to advocates, their journey had been one of transformation and discovery. And though the path ahead was uncertain, Sarah knew one thing for sure: as long as she and Mark stood together, there was no obstacle they couldn't overcome, no truth they couldn't uncover, and no life they couldn't change for the better. The story of the nurse who donated a kidney to a stranger, only to discover he was her long-lost brother, had evolved into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. It had become a beacon of hope for countless others, a catalyst for change, and a testament to the enduring power of truth, love, and the unbreakable bonds of family. As they closed the door on another day of fighting for justice, Sarah and Mark stepped forward into their shared future, ready to write the next chapter of their extraordinary story, together. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to support us by leaving a like and subscribing to our Slices of Life channel. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Which city are you talking about? It's very rewarding for us to provide our followers with an enjoyable moment. We appreciate the unconditional support you show us in every story. Blessings.